Thank you. I was honored to be invited, and I've been looking forward to this opportunity to speak about a topic that I've only been thinking about for a short time, but it's clear to me that it's likely to occupy my research interests for quite some time in the future, and that's the question of international governance of climate engineering. Now, despite the fancy title, that's really all it is, International Governance of Climate Engineering. But since I gave you the title, I thought I should tell you a little bit about the story of Phaeton, for those of you who don't know it. Phaeton is a child. It's a story from Greek mythology, and you can find it in Ovid's Metamorphoses and other places, Greek and Roman mythology. Anyway, Phaeton as a child didn't know his father, and when he became a young man, his mother told him that his father was the sun god, Helios in Greece and Apollo in Roman mythology. Phaeton wasn't sure he believed this, but he journeyed to the kingdom of the sun to find out. And sure enough, when he got there, Helios greeted him as his son and welcomed him. But Phaeton said, well, I don't believe you, prove it, basically, as teenagers are wont to do. And Helios said, okay, and to prove his parental affection for Phaeton, he made an unbreakable oath that he would give Phaeton anything he wanted. And Phaeton said, well, I want to drive your chariot for a day. And Helios was horrified at this suggestion, and he proceeded to beg Phaeton to ask for something else. He warned Phaeton that even the other gods would never dare to dream of driving his chariot, that it was folly. Ovid's words in English translation, choose out a gift from seas or earth or skies, for open to your wish all nature lies, only decline this one unequal task, for 'tis a mischief, not a gift you ask. But Phaeton was determined. He said, I'm going to ride and drive that chariot. So eventually Helios turned over his chariot after anointing his son with a magic oil that would prevent him from being burned. And he urged Phaeton, and I'm not kidding, this is what Ovid says, he urged Phaeton to drive carefully, not too fast, and stay in the middle of the road. Well, of course, it was a disaster. Phaeton couldn't control the horses pulling the chariot. First, they climbed too high, and the earth began to freeze. And then when Phaeton dropped the reins, the horses dove to the ground, and they veered up north. They melted the polar ice cap, releasing the monster in the ice cap. Then they went over the mountain ranges and melted the snow and glaciers in the Pyrenees and the Alps and the Caucasus. And then they swooped down over the rivers and dried up the rivers and lakes. And then they went over the sea and killed the fish at the top and drove the god of the sea to the bottom. Then they went over the plains where the crops were about to be harvested and burned up all the crops. And then Ovid says, but these are trivial ills. He says, whole cities burned and people's kingdoms into ashes turned. So finally, the goddess of the earth begged Zeus to do something about this kid who was running amok and ruining the earth. And Zeus did. He eventually threw a thunderbolt, struck Phaeton from the chariot, caused the chariot to crash, and the disaster was over. Helios went and hid, and in various stories of the myth, the earth was dark for anywhere from 1 to 4 days because the sun never came out again. But eventually, Zeus persuaded Helios to return to the sky in his chariot, and that's the story. Now, when I ran across this myth, I thought it was an absolutely irresistible allegory for climate change and for what our society is doing to the climate and why we're doing it. We're like the stubborn and determined teenager Phaeton. We insist on continuing on the path we've determined for ourselves, despite the huge risks of catastrophe that we're told about. We insist on doing it because, well, we want to do it. You know, I want to drive your chariot. I want to do what I want to do. And one might think that the ancient storytellers were prophets. So accurately did they describe the likely consequences of our modern folly. Melting glaciers and polar ice, burning cities, devastated crops, disappearing fresh water, and wounded oceans. It's an amazing allegory. But the story serves equally well, maybe even better, as an allegorical warning about an increasingly discussed solution to climate change, and that is geoengineering. Despite warnings from Helios that only Helios, not even the other gods, could control the untethered forces of nature, despite being told that he was undertaking a risk that even the other gods would not attempt, Phaeton was convinced in his hubris that he could keep a tight rein on his father's chariot and he could direct it where he would. And the consequences for Phaeton, I never know how to pronounce it, I apologize, ultimately was death at the behest of an outraged and devastated world. So that's the story, and that's the allegory. And tonight I want to talk with you about the climate engineering solution, or the geoengineering solution to climate change, about the challenges it poses for international policy. I'm a lawyer, not a scientist. Scientists would talk to you about the technical challenges. I want to talk to you about the policy challenges it poses, and whether we will be able to govern the forces of nature, the scientists unleashed, in a way that serves rather than defeats our purposes. Oh, I forget I have slides. Sorry. We're going to go backwards one. Because you need to see Phaeton. There he is, taking off, and there he is after Zeus decided it was ending. And there's what the poet says. Greatly he failed, but greatly he dared. So what is geoengineering? Come on. People debate the definition, and some people debate what practices should be considered geoengineering or not. This is the basic definition I think that works. Geoengineering is the deliberate, large-scale modification of Earth's systems for the purpose of counteracting climate change. The preferred term that's developing is climate engineering, and I don't know if that will catch on, but that's what the scientists are wanting us to call it. There are two primary categories of techniques. One is carbon dioxide removal and sequestration, which also is called remediation technologies, technologies that take the carbon out and try to reduce the concentrations of greenhouse gases in that way. And the other techniques are solar radiation management, techniques that design to counteract, not to change the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, but to reduce the amount of energy that gets into the atmosphere as a way of keeping the climate cool. I'm sorry, I've got to. So this slide, I know it's hard to see. You can find it on the web. That's where I found it. It's just a slide of several of the different techniques that people are talking about. Each of these techniques has different challenges, different cost factors, different advantages or disadvantages. And I want to talk about just a couple of them in particular. because they're the ones that are most frequently talked about as potentially realistic solutions. On the CO2 removal side, on a planetary scale, one of the things that's talked about as being quite feasible, although recent experiments suggest that maybe it isn't as feasible as people thought, is ocean fertilization. It's well known that in different parts of the ocean there's a lot less phytoplankton than would be expected given the nutrients in that part of the ocean. And the suspicion is it's because of the absence of a particular nutrient, iron. So there's a belief that if you fertilize the ocean with iron, or fertilize these parts of the ocean with iron, you'll get a lot more algae, a lot more phytoplankton, and that will absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sequester it in the ocean as the dead algae or the dead animals that ate the algae sink to the bottom. The scientists who first initiated this idea said something along the lines of, give me $100 million and I can give you an ice age. So he was quite sure that ocean fertilization could work a major change in the planetary system. So that's frequently discussed. There are several other methods of removing carbon dioxide, especially genetically engineered plants and trees, forestry practices, biochar. There's a number of different things that would fall in the category of bioengineering. In the category of solar radiation management, we're talking about anything that causes the Earth to reflect more sunlight away so that less gets in. And the proposals range from putting mirrors up in space, hugely expensive, to the one that's most frequently talked about, putting sulfur into the stratosphere, in the form of aerosols, to make the stratosphere more reflective. And that's pretty cheap. Send up airplanes and dump it in. And there are other things, painting the roofs of houses white, all sorts of other proposals for increasing the Earth's albedo in one way or another to increase its reflectivity and decrease the amount of energy that gets into the planet. All of these techniques are under discussion. Each of them has their own champion, their own people working on them.